Hate to break up these wonderful and rich conversations, but we have another one, our final panel that we're very excited about here. We have our two panelists and our wonderful moderator here, a good friend of NCAI and Indian Country, Mr. Mark Trahant, is a member of Idaho Shoshone-Bannock Tribe and a former president of the Native American Journalists Association. I've increasingly learned how important media is in telling our stories in terms of research and dissemination. He currently serves as the Atwood Journalism Chair at the University of Alaska-Anchorage. A lot of good Alaska representation here today. Mr. Trahant was recently a Kaiser Media Fellow and is the former editor of the editorial page for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. He is the author of The Last Great Battle of the Indian Wars, about Henry Jackson, Forrest Girard, and the campaign for American Indian self-determination. Please welcome Mr. Mark Trahant.
Thank you. I've learned a lot today. I've really appreciated being a part of this. Just to be clear, since there's been so much really great work from the Academy here, I'm not an academic, although I play one on campus. Every time I hear academics talk about the IRB process, as a journalist, I'm absolutely mortified. I know how much it would change our profession if we actually asked permission from what we do. Nonetheless, I'm impressed and learned a lot today. Whenever I hear today's panel, we're going to be talking about the ethics of blood. And when I first heard about this panel, I remembered a story that I worked on really about 20 years ago. I was here in Washington, and the White Earth, Minnesota tribe was facing a really complicated land dispute involving the theft of quite literally millions of acres of land. And in that land dispute, a story came out that around 1909, as part of the discovery process, the government sent a science officer out to White Earth and started collecting hair samples. And this is, of course, long before modern DNA. But they took these hair samples and took them back to Washington, D.C., and from the hair samples determined who was full blood and who was mixed. And it began the long process, as I said, of the theft of millions of acres of land at White Earth in Minnesota. And it really was an interesting thing to me because, this story stuck with me. I actually looked it up before coming here, because the idea that on one hand there's so much promise, on the other hand there's the potential and indeed the history of misuse. We have a fascinating panel. I'm looking forward to it. And start by introducing Nanibaa Garrison. Dr. Garrison is Assistant Professor of Pediatrics at the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Society at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. She earned her PhD at the Department of Genetics at Stanford University and went on to complete postdoctoral fellowships at the Centers for Biomedical Ethics and the Integration of Research on Genetics and Ethics. Her research focused on the impact of the Havasupai tribe lawsuit on genetic research and institutional review boards. Dr. Garrison's current research interests include genetic research on Native American communities, informed consent, and the issues of privacy and confidentiality. Dr. Garrison joined the faculty at Vanderbilt University in 2013. Please welcome Dr. Garrison.
Yate she Nanibaa Garrison Yanishia Ashi Hinishla do Balagana Bushes Chain Torachini Dashache Balagana Dashanella. Hi everybody, I'm Nanibaa Garrison, and I just introduced myself to you in the Navajo language, stating that my first clan is from the Salt clan. I grew up on the Navajo reservation in Arizona and took multiple different perspectives as I was going through college and graduate schools. So what I'm going to talk to you today is titled The Ethics of Blood, and I actually struggled with this title quite a bit because there are so many different ways to think about blood and what is intertwined with blood. And today what I'll do is tell you some of my perspectives as a Dene person going through school as a geneticist and my experiences as a geneticist and how that transitioned and carried me through becoming a bioethicist, I was always interested in some of the ethical issues around some of the genetic research I was conducting. And I'll share some of those stories with you today. So this is a picture of the Navajo Nation in Monument Valley, and some of these stories that I'll tell you today are based in this part of the U.S. So we've been talking a lot today about what blood is, what DNA is. Some people have talked a little bit about some of the notions around what blood may contain. We heard a previous presentation about blood groups, different types of blood groups, information about. So blood contains information about blood groups. They contain information about your cholesterol levels, whether you carry a virus or a bacterial infection. They could tell you about cancers, and it also has information about your genetics, and blood contains DNA. We also have different notions about blood, and I want to acknowledge a scholar here in the room, Jesse Bardil, who has done a lot of research around notions of blood, more from a figurative sense. But it's not uncommon to hear people say that I am the blood of my mother, I am the blood of my father, that I have these bloodlines that I can trace back to my family history. So what can blood tell us? What can we learn about a person through their blood? Does blood inform anybody about familial relationships? The answer is yes, but how do you address that question? You can think about it from multiple different senses, from biological familial relationships, genetic relationships, or storytelling. And these stories can be told through different bloodlines as well. So I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about some of the taboos that people have mentioned briefly today, and some of the teachings and lessons that I was taught as a child growing up on the Navajo reservation about what to do with my biological samples if they were to be discarded or removed or dispelled from my body. And so I won't go into all of the details about what these taboos mean or how they are housed in our cultural teachings, but I just want to give you a sense of what some of these biological materials are and give you a sense of why they are so important for us to take care of them. I was told, I grew up in a remote part of the reservation, and a lot of times my grandmother had me go out and herd sheep, and so I followed the sheep into the canyons with my siblings and sought water and food for the sheep. And when you're out there, you're out there for hours and hours. You have to go sometime. And so we'd go find a bush and, find some privacy, go to the restroom, and then when you're done, you cover up the urine, because we were told that if you didn't do that, you were not disposing of that properly, and somebody else might come along and do something to it. I don't know what she meant. I didn't know what she meant at the time, but that was something that we always did. We were also always told to not cut your hair or your fingernails at night. When you do cut your hair and your fingernails, dispose of them properly so that nobody else can come along and do something to those samples or to those pieces that came from your body. There's also some notions around blood and how to handle blood properly. And so we were told to, if you cut yourself or during menstrual cycles, you clean up your own blood and you don't let other people take care of that for you, because if you do, you might put them in harm's way, and that person might need a ceremony to protect themselves from the spirits that came from your body. There's also notions about what you do with a child's placenta and burying that placenta near home, because it ties that child to their homelands. And this last notion that a lot of people mentioned throughout the day, when somebody dies, you need to bury all of the body parts, including blood, so that they make a safe passage to the next world. What's not really said specifically here is a notion of genetics and genes, but we do know that you can extract DNA from each of these different types of samples, and you can learn something about a person from these different types of samples. And so there's also a notion that there is a spiritual connection to these samples as well. So this picture is of the late Frank Dukapu, who was a Hopi geneticist who was campaigning to really try to help researchers understand some of the scientific and cultural implications of doing research with Native people. And one quote that I really love from him was, "To us, any part of ourselves is sacred. Scientists say it's just DNA. For an Indian, it's not just DNA, it's part of a person. It is sacred, with deep religious significance. It is part of the essence of a person." And so I highlight this because there has been this notion, even though this quote was 15 years or 20 years old, there is this notion that there is something that is contained in DNA, something that is contained in blood that could tell something about a person, and it does connect a person to that sample. So I'm going to shift a little bit and tell you some personal experiences in collecting samples, given all of this context that I brought with me while I was a young undergraduate student starting to work in different laboratories and working with human samples. I was also very involved in collecting DNA samples from a number of people from a number of different perspectives and for a number of different research projects. So I collected samples from Native American people who told me that they were very interested in the science, they wanted to support me, they were engaged, but during the informed consent process, some people brought up questions about what I was going to do with these samples. I was involved in a pigmentation study that was funded by the National Department of Justice, or the, So it was a pigmentation project that was funded by the Department of Justice. And so naturally people were like, what are you going to do with those samples? Are you going to use it for forensics, or are you going to be able to take my DNA sample from the street and figure out what my phenotype is so that you can identify me as a person? Other people were concerned with spiritual connections to their samples. Some people were concerned about gene therapy. There was a mention earlier to Dolly the sheep. In the context of talking about Dolly the sheep with Navajo people, a lot of Navajo people were actually very disturbed because the Dolly the sheep was seen as something that might be messing with nature or with creation. And in Navajo culture, sheep is a very big part of the Navajo culture and Navajo life. And people raise sheep, they weave rugs with their wool. And so that was something that was seen to be a big concern. I've also collected samples from people who were dog owners, and their concerns were also very interesting because they were concerned that we were putting a cheek swab sample, putting a swab into their dog's mouth, and they were not sure what was on the sample or on the swab. They wanted to make sure that we were not going to poison their prized dog at these dog shows that I was attending. And so these concerns are not unique to any one group or any one perception, any one perspective, but they are concerns nonetheless. And so this process of conducting the informed consent process, where I was busy responding to questions, I was also very busy trying to build trust and keep promises with people. And it required a lot of patience. People have all sorts of questions. Some of them are kind of wacky and wild, and others are very good, legitimate questions about what I was going to do with a sample. Was I going to return the sample to the patient after, or the participant after I was done with the study, or was I going to use it for other things? What happens if we decide that we want to use the samples for other studies? And so that really informed a lot of the questions that I had around what researchers should do with samples. So there's other connections that people mentioned to blood and saliva samples. There's also views around ownership and personhood. So we heard some talks earlier about biobanking and what happens to samples when the person who the sample came from passes away. Do those samples return to that person or not? There's also questions about return of samples. But what do you do if these samples are de-identified and you have no idea who the identity of that person was? And so these concerns are coming up more in the context of data sharing policies, and when researchers want to share de-identified samples with other researchers, how does that connection, how do Native people view that connection? Is there still a spiritual connection when the samples are de-identified? There's a lot of concern around privacy in genomics, and this report that came out by the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues goes through a lot of different privacy concerns that have been brought up in the context of genomic research and whole genome sequencing. And there's one quote that I found in the report that says, "Without trust and confidentiality and security of the data, individuals will be less likely to participate in research." We also do know that re-identification of de-identified samples is possible if we have just a few identifiers like name, ages, and addresses. And because these samples are no longer classified as human subjects, researchers are allowed to share these samples with other researchers, but when these samples are re-identified, then what would that mean for scientific progress going forward, and how would Native people feel about this, about having their samples in a federal repository where their samples may potentially be re-identified. And there are a lot of policies around that, and there's a lot of conversations going on with tribes and what to do with data sharing, and different tribes have different perspectives on this. Some tribes don't mind if their tribal affiliation is labeled with their samples, and others do. And so this point has been covered many times today. There are 566 federally recognized tribes in the U.S., and there's such a diversity of opinions. We know that from the Policy Resource Center's guide on genetics for tribal researchers, and that different tribes have different perspectives. Some tribes embrace genetic research, and other tribes do not. But there's a lot of challenges moving forward in building trust, respecting others. There's also challenges about transparency. How do we be transparent as researchers and about sample use and reporting these research results back to participants? What results are important? Are all the results important? Who owns the results after after this study is completed? The Navajo Nation's Human Research Review Board has a policy in place that all of the research data that has been gained through the process of conducting research ultimately goes back to the tribe and becomes becomes owners of that data. But not all tribes have policies like that, and different tribes have different perspectives on that. So these challenges remain. What do we do with these de-identified samples when one person wishes to withdraw or wants the samples returned? Is there a spiritual connection to these samples when they are de-identified? If they are not, how do we address these questions about withdrawal of samples? And so there's actually quite a few different things that are going on that are starting to address these questions. There have been a lot of different discussions with tribes that will allow for complete collaboration with tribes. There's a lot of community-based research out there, and NIH is also encouraging researchers to form these collaborations with communities before the research process begins. There's also increased regulation by tribal IRBs and increased training opportunities for Native Americans and Indigenous trainees, including scientists, researchers, and physicians. And I also want to point out that there's a summer internship for Native Americans in genomics. And this is a program that started a couple of years ago in 2010, and we just had the third workshop this past June. And so there's cards out in the front if you want to get more information about that. But I think through all of these different training opportunities and these discussions and these forums like this and symposia like this, we have begun this discussion and need to continue to keep this discussion going. So I just want to briefly thank a couple of different people who have been involved in all of this, and they come from various institutions like Vanderbilt, Stanford, NCAI, NHGRI, and the summer internship for Native Americans in genomics. Thank you.